Okay, Bezrat Hashem Yitbarach. So we're going to be continuing from last week, and the main focus, Bezrat Hashem, of this class is going to be the topic of borer, separating. Now we know that borer is something that comes up very, very, very often um, in the almost every Shabbat, right? It comes up especially for women that are preparing the food in the kitchen before the husbands come home or after. It doesn't make a difference. It can even be done by men. And we spoke about last week the three conditions for borer, the three conditions that would allow you to do borer. The first one we said is that you have to take the good from the bad. The second condition we said is that you have to take it with your hand and not with a utensil. And we explained that a fork, a spoon, a knife, those type of things are considered part of your hand. And the third condition we said is that it has to be done for right away, for at that moment. And we also explained last week what that is. So we said it's we said that there's opinions where it's from when the men come out of the shul before they come home. There is other opinions that say that it has to be done right next to the meal, like right as soon as we're starting to sit down for the meal. There's other opinions that allow it up to half an hour before we start sitting down to the meal so that we can get the meal prepared. Again, each one according to their custom. Now, when contrary to Yom Tov, contrary to Yom Tov, we know that on Yom Tov, generally what we're allowed to do, we're allowed to do most things, not everything, but we're allowed to do most things that have to do with food that we not normally wouldn't be able to do on Shabbat. We're able to do on Yom Tov, for example, cooking. There are differences. Bezat Hashem, hopefully we'll be able to cover those things. But on Yom Tov, there's a very big difference between the borer that is allowed on Yom Tov and the borer that is allowed on Shabbat. And the main difference between the two is what are you separating? Meaning, on Yom Tov, when we are allowed to separate on Yom Tov, the halacha is you're allowed to do borer on Yom Tov. However, you're only allowed to do the easier part, the easier separating. Meaning, you look at the mixture of whatever's in front of you, and if the good is the minority, so then you have to take out the good from the bad. If the bad is the minority, then you take out the bad from the good. Meaning, you always look at whatever's the minority, and from there, that's what you take out. This is the halacha for Yom Tov. For Shabbat, it doesn't work like that. For Shabbat, it's no matter how much good, no matter how much bad, it doesn't matter. We can only take the good from the bad, even if the good from the bad is less than the bad from the good. Okay, so that's one major difference when it comes to borer on Shabbat and borer on Yom Tov. Now, we also spoke about briefly last week that if a person has something that there's the good and bad kind of mixed into each other. So there are two examples that we're going to talk about, Be'ezrat Hashem. One of them would be, for example, you have a cluster of grapes, and you have some of the grapes that are less desirable. Sometimes they can even be completely rotten, and you have the grapes that you want. So on Shabbat, what you have to obviously make sure of is if you're going to be separating, if you're going to be taking off the grapes, you would have to make sure to take only the good grapes and not take off the bad grapes. Another example would be, for example, lettuce, right? You have a whole heart of lettuce. You have a whole, if it's lettuce, romaine lettuce, all those cabbage, the same thing would apply to cabbage technically. The outer leaves many times can be rotten. So what do we do in that case? We remove the outer leaves and then we get to the inner leaves. On Shabbat, if they are attached, you would be allowed to take off the rotten leaves. You would be allowed to remove the rotten leaves, even though what you're now doing is you're taking off the bad from the good. And the reason for this is because in this particular case, you're not able to access the good without encountering the bad. So in that case, we allow you to remove the bad to access the good. The same thing would apply technically if you have a fruit bowl. And on top of the fruit bowl, you have a few fruits that are either fruits that you don't want. For example, you have a mixture of apples and oranges. And like we said last week also, that between apples and oranges, if you don't want one or the other, there would be a concept of borer. So you have a mixture of apples and oranges, or you have even apples themselves or oranges themselves. It doesn't make a difference what fruit it is, even bananas technically. And some of them are rotten, and the good ones are underneath. So we said borer, you're not allowed to take out the bad. But in this case, since you're not able to access the good without the bad, without encountering the bad, so what you can do and what you're allowed to do is you're allowed to move the bad to the side in order to access the good. Okay, so that's the reason why for lettuce, for example, we would be allowed to remove the outer rotten leaves in order to be able to get to the good leaves. However, this is only true, once again, if it is attached. They're all together, because then you can't access it. But if there are just, again, you have already pre-cut leaves, you have leaves that are already separated. So in that case, you would not be allowed to remove the bad leaves from the good leaves, and you would have to make sure to do it in the permitted manner, which is to take the good from the bad. Another concept of that we also discussed a little bit last week was if there is let's say we gave the example of a salad. So we gave the example where it's a cucumber, tomato, and onion salad, and a person doesn't like either the cucumbers, or some don't like the tomatoes, some don't like the onions. You would be allowed to take out whatever you don't want personally, and whatever you take out, you make sure to give to someone else that likes it. So let's say you don't like the onions. What you do is you take out the onions. You would not be allowed to take the onions and put them back into the main bowl. You would have to give them directly to someone else that is there, so that they should eat the onions. Because when you're doing that, there's no bad over here, because since it's food and it's going to be eaten, it's not separating good from bad or bad from good, because it's all food, it's all the same. It only applies when there's something that you don't want and it's something that you're going to be putting aside, then it turns it into bad. But when you're giving it to someone else, it turns it into good, so it's good from good. That's what we said last week. Now, what we're going to add this week is the same thing would apply if technically you have food that is rotten, right? So it's not, so that is going to be completely considered bad. But what you can do if you have a pet, right, and only if it's specifically a pet, because if it doesn't belong to you, you shouldn't be feeding animals that don't belong to you on Shabbat. So you have a pet, you can give them whatever bad you don't want, and you can allow them to eat it. Obviously, this is only if the pet would actually eat what you're giving to them. Meaning you can't just say, okay, let me do borer, let me take the bad from the good, and I'll put it in front of the animal. If the animal eats it, good. If the animal doesn't eat it, not good. No, it has to be something that the animal could actually eat, to once again allow this concept of you're not separating bad from good, you're separating good from good, because what you're now separating is going to be used for another purpose. We also discussed a little bit when it comes to peeling, right? You would be allowed to peel fruits, you would be allowed to peel vegetables, once again, on condition that it is close to the meal. You cannot just peel and let it, let it sit just for a while. It has to be close to the meal. The same thing would apply to removing a pit from a fruit. So, for example, to remove the pits from dates, or to remove, if there's olives, you would also be allowed to do the same thing. Another food that comes up very often in terms of pits, Nowadays, less. I remember more as a child we had this issue. Now, Baruch Hashem, they more or less took care of it. Was watermelons. Watermelon pits from the watermelon. So we know that when a person is eating the watermelon, they obviously don't want the pits, right? So if you were to remove the pits from the watermelon, right? So it would be considered technically removing the bad from the good. Okay. However, and this is going to open like more cases and things that come up very often when it comes to a watermelon in particular. The Ben Ish Chai gives a solution. He says, let's say you have the slice in front of you. So what you do is you take the slice, you shake it up a little bit. If there are any loose seeds on it, those loose seeds are going to fall off. Okay. And then any seeds that remain are considered to be part of the fruit. And in that case, since they're considered to be part of the fruit, and the normal way to eat them, or a normal manner of eating them, is to remove whatever's bad, you would be allowed to do that. Okay. So basically, the concept that's going to be spoken about now, or the concept that's going to be coming up, is if um, you have something that is one entity, okay, and inside that entity there are parts that are undesired. There are parts that aren't wanted. As long as everything is still attached, you would be allowed to separate. So this is technically a big differentiation. There's going to be a big differentiation between the Ashkenazim and the Sfaradim. This comes up very, very much when we deal with fish. We know on Shabbat that there is a big mitzvah to have fish on Shabbat. The Ashkenazim, we know they have what's called gefilte fish. Okay, there are two main reasons why the Ashkenazim they had gefilte fish. Okay, gefilte fish is basically it's fish ground up, mixed with flour and a couple of other things, sometimes even sugar, whatever it is, and it's basically made into a roll. The Sephardim, we normally call it like kind of fish balls, but that's what the Ashkenazim had. Now there were two main reasons why the Ashkenazim had or started making the gefilte fish. One was because it was a problem of borer. For them, they were afraid that if they were to serve fish as it was, people would remove the pins, people would remove the skin. And for the Ashkenazim, contrary to what we were just saying, for Ashkenazim, even if it's all part of one entity, if you're removing part of it that isn't good, it is a problem. You would not be allowed to do that. So to avoid that problem, they said, we're not going to have any fish that is possible to have bones. Before Shabbat, they're going to grind everything and basically avoid that problem of having to separate on Shabbat. That was one reason. And a second reason, which is less relevant, was the Ashkenazim, they generally lived in colder countries, in cities that were not necessarily close to bodies of water or something like that. So they had less of a possibility, or it was harder for them to attain fish. So they said, and it was also very expensive by them. So in order to allow people, even like poorer people, to have some of the fish, they would take the fish mixed in with a bunch of other things to make the volume a lot bigger and to make it being able to be spread out a lot more for even a smaller quantity. So this machloket, this argument of what we were discussing before, is true for fish, right? The Sfaradim would be allowed to remove fish bones and the fish skin, as long as they're still attached, as long as they're all part of it before eating. Okay. Once again, this should be done while you're eating, meaning it should be done while it's in the plate. And the same applies, and before that. So you can also do that for a child. So, for example, you have a fish that has bones, you would be allowed to separate the fish. You would be allowed to take out all the bones in order to be able to serve your child afterwards. And you don't say, oh, it has to be done in your plate. No, you can do it for others as long as, once again, it is close to the meal. That is number one. Another example would be when it gets to meat, right? You have pieces of fat on meat. You have sometimes meat with a bone. You once again, the Sfaradim, they would be allowed to remove it. They would be allowed to put it aside, as opposed to the Ashkenazim, where once again they wouldn't be allowed to, do that. Okay. Another halakha that in a way comes up from this would be, and I'm sure this has come up a few times, is if a person is making chicken. Okay. When a person is making chicken, and when they're cooking it, or I guess when they're serving it, they realize that there are some feathers that are still attached to the skin. Now, we obviously don't want to be eating the feathers. So for Sfaradim, there would be no problem of removing the feathers from the chicken. Okay. Some Ashkenazim are strict with this. Now, removing feathers from a chicken can be another problem. Can be another problem of gozez, of shearing. Okay, Be'ezrat Hashem, once we go along, we're going to see that there's a melacha of gozez, of shearing, of removing parts of an animal that were attached in, okay, or parts even of a human. For example, you wouldn't be allowed to cut nails because of that issue of gozez on Shabbat. So normally speaking, we should not be allowed to remove feathers from the chicken because it would be gozez, let alone borev. However, since the chicken is already cooked, there are many that are lenient with it. They say that gozez only applies if it wasn't cooked. If it's already cooked, then there is no problem. Again, there are Ashkenazim that are strict with this. Another very common form of borel that can come up is with utensils. What I mean by utensils is with forks, knives, spoons, all of that, where after we finish washing the dishes, okay, again, in a permitted manner, which means that we're not washing to prepare for Motzei Shabbat, right? We are washing either, one reason is because we're going to be reusing it. So, for example, Friday night, we have the Friday night meal. And after we finish the meal, so we clear the dishes and we normally wash them, right? Some wash them the night, some wash them the following morning, as long as it's being reused for Shabbat afterwards. So you're not preparing, you're not saving yourself a job after Shabbat. That would be one instance, or one case of allowing to wash dishes on Shabbat. Another one would be, and this is dependent on the person themselves. Sometimes you have people that it really bothers them to see dirty dishes in the sink. So, sorry. So if such a person would want to wash the dishes just so that they can have a clean counter and it can look more aesthetic for them, that would also be allowed. Why? Because the purpose of washing the dishes for someone like that is for cleanliness, is for their own personal comfort for Shabbat. It's not necessarily to save themselves the time after Shabbat of washing the dishes. Rather, it's being done for that moment so that they can feel better. Because otherwise, they would be very disturbed seeing such a messy kitchen. Okay, so that's when you would be allowed to wash dishes on Shabbat. Now, after we wash the dishes, what we often want to do is we also want to put away the dishes. We want to, leave the counter clean. We want to leave it clean. Now, if we were to wash all the utensils, all the forks and the knives and the spoons, we were to wash them all together and then start separating them into forks, knives, and spoons, each one apart. So there are opinions that say that even though it's not food, it would be considered boreh. It would be considered to separate. So the solution they give is to dry each one individually. So you have the whole bunch of them, and some of them are still slightly wet. So you pick up one by one and you dry it with a towel one by one, and then you put it directly where it belongs. So when you're separating them or when you're removing each individual, you're not separating. What you're doing is you're drying. And once it's already in your hand, once it's already separated from the batch that's in front of you, then you can put it wherever you want and you can sort it out. Okay, this is the best solution. If a person forgets or if it's too bothersome for a person to do that, for Sfaradim, it would be possible to separate them once they're all dried. And for Ashkenazim, there are different opinions, so each one should technically ask their rabbi what would be the halacha for separating dishes. The same thing technically applies also to clothing. Okay, so if we're going through the closet and we want to like start separating clothing, right? For Ashkenazim, it's more problematic. For Sfaradim, less. But even for Sfaradim, we should try to avoid it if possible. Okay. Using a salt shaker on Shabbat. So very commonly, people put inside the salt shakers, they put rice. The reason why people put rice in salt shakers is because rice, we know, absorbs liquids, absorbs moisture, and salt, if there's any moisture around salt, so then the salt can get clumpy. The salt is no longer fine. So what people do is they put grains of rice inside the salt. So if there's any moisture, the rice is going to absorb it and the salt remains the same. If we were to use a salt shaker, so it's very possible to say that we are doing borer at that point. Why? Because what we're doing is we're separating the salt from the rice. Okay. However, the Sfaradim, when it comes to this, they are lenient. Why? Because they say that we're not separating the salt, even though yes, that's what's actually physically going on, but there's no intent. In fact, what's remaining there is the bad, which means that what we're taking out is the good, and it would be okay. The Ashkenazim, however, when it comes to salt shakers on Shabbat, they are strict with the salt shakers, that they don't want to use salt shakers on Shabbat. Another halacha that comes up is washing dirty fruit. So if there's dirt on a fruit, right, that would technically be considered boel if I were to remove the dirt, especially if I'm removing the dirt. However, when we're washing it and we're preparing it for eating, that's not a problem, because once again, it would be otherwise impossible to eat it properly. And it's kind of reminiscent of what we started the class with, where you're removing the bad in order to get to the good. But once again, even when you do that, even when you're washing fruit, it has to be done for right away, meaning you shouldn't be doing it and leaving it for a long time, or you shouldn't be just washing fruit and then have it for the next meal, or have extra, wash a bunch at a time to leave over. You should be washing only specifically what you are going to be using, or what you're going to be using immediately. Now, obviously, if you're serving a fruit platter and you're not going to have to measure, okay, each person has this amount of fruit, you can obviously wash a quantity, as long as it's normal for such a quantity to be served, and it would be possible for that quantity to be eaten. Okay, now.
All right, so just in terms of preparing, so after lunch, you can't just start cutting up fruits for Seudah Shlishi.
No.
You're right closer to when you're going to eat Seudah Shlishi.
No, you shouldn't be doing that. Unless, no, yeah, that's it. You shouldn't be doing it.
Unless you're in December and Seudah Shlishit is right after lunch.
What about if I take something to eat in the morning? So I say.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
What about if I'm preparing, I'm washing a lot of strawberries, I'm cutting the strawberries. What if I do 40 and eat 5 in the moment? So it's like, I'm doing for now, but it's such a, like it's a tricky way to do it. You know what I'm saying? Like if you have a pleasure of that right now and the rest you leave.
Sorry, I didn't hear that too clearly.
I'm taking fruit salad.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, 1 second, because we see you on one screen and we speak to you on another device, that's why.
So I want to cut some fruit salad for Seudah Shlishit. But what
Okay.
about if it's 2 o'clock and my daughter say, "Mommy, I would like, I would like to do it for my daughter, and the rest I will leave it for the Seudah Shlishit. But I'm making also for her to eat it right now.
Very good.
I will make
You
a
would
big
not
pot,
be
but she only take one.
very good. You would not be able to do that.
No.
Meaning we learned the same thing also when it comes to borer in general, that let's say Friday night, right? You're preparing whatever it is, and you say, okay, I'm gonna be serving this in the morning also, so let me just prepare everything right now. You would not be allowed to do that. So the same thing applies. The same thing applies even if it's only a few hours away. But as long as it's not being done for immediate use, there's a problem of borer.
Wow.
Okay, so you basically you wash what you're about to eat.
I what?
You wash what you're about to eat. Okay, so you take like a handful, like you think you're going to eat a handful. That's what you should be washing at that moment.
Wow. Sometimes it's good not to know.
Yeah, but like I said, borer is something that comes up almost every Shabbat, many times.
Yes, this is like, I know my son was telling me, "Mommy, now you're learning so much halakha, you will know that you do many things wrong." It's like, but actually I do it. I do like lunchtime. I do prepare like for that.
Also for Seudah Shlishit, I do too, like, I'm making fruits for lunch, I'm like, oh, let me make extract, I'm gonna have people for Seudah Shlishit, and then like I should make it later.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Oh, we should get everything for sure.
That's
Or,
right.
yeah.
That's a real thing.
And then the same thing, like to tell your housekeeper, like, oh, can you cut up all the fruit for me for the afternoon? Like she shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
What
Again,
about
your housekeeper technically, it's something that I was actually discussing today with some of my students at school. Your housekeeper shouldn't be doing anything for you that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Okay, so for example, even if you have a live-in, technically your housekeeper should not be doing for you laundry in any circumstance on Shabbat. Okay, she's allowed to do things for you on Shabbat, whatever you would be allowed to do. However, she's not limited to what we can do. So, for example, the examples that I gave the students were, if you were to want, if the cleaning lady or whatever it was, she would want to use a dishwasher on Shabbat, she would be allowed to do so. Why? Because you're allowed to wash dishes, which means she's allowed to wash dishes. If she's allowed to wash dishes, we don't have to limit her how she does it. She's able to do it in any way that she wants. And for her, it's more convenient, it's easier to wash them in the dishwasher. So that means that when she is using the dishwasher, she is not using the dishwasher for you, she is using the dishwasher for herself. The same would apply with a vacuum cleaner. So you're allowed to sweep your house on Shabbat, which means she can sweep the house on Shabbat. However, for her, it's more convenient if she were to use the vacuum cleaner, because then she doesn't have to do the work twice, whatever it is. So when she's using the vacuum cleaner, she's not using the vacuum cleaner for you, she's using the vacuum cleaner for herself. Now, things that she's not allowed to do, okay, cooking obviously for sure not. There's other problems that come with them cooking, for example, bishul goy and all those stuff. Turning on the lights, technically speaking, uh she shouldn't be turning on lights for you. If she's turning them on for herself, you can ask her to just leave it on. But if she's turning them on for you, she shouldn't be doing that, because once again, you're not allowed to turn on a light, so you can't ask her to turn on a light for you. Now, we all know that there are ways around it, meaning if it's something that is going to completely ruin your Shabbat, like it's something that is like your whole Shabbat is dependent on having the light there, or for example, the electricity jumped, and if you don't have electricity, you're not going to have any food for Shabbat, meaning your whole Oneg Shabbat is going to be ruined. So we know that there is the leniency, and it's a leniency, it's not like straight halacha, but there is the leniency that you can ask the non-Jew to do it for you in a hint. You ask them, you don't ask them directly. You tell them, oh, all the electricity jumped. Like, wow, I don't know, like, I don't know how to, like, what to do, right? And then they understand on their own that they should turn it on. Or it's so hot in here. Like, who turned up the AC? Like, oh, it's so hot. And then they understand to lower the AC on their own, right?
Wait, if I'm the light, yes, but what about the food? If I forgot to turn on the toilet or the toilet turn off because whatever, she could put it on the food.
So again, that is very complicated. I had a different case which was easier to allow, which was the Jew put it in on Shabbat, before Shabbat. It was in the crock pot, everything was okay. And then for some reason, the non-Jew came and unplugged it.
Okay.
Okay, and that happens sometimes when you have the hired help at home. They I guess they don't pay attention or whatever it is, and they unplugged it. So what I told them was, if it's still hot, you can ask them to put it back. You can ask them to plug it back in. Okay, and the main reason behind that was because you did what you were supposed to. By you telling them to do it again, you should obviously do it in the permitted manner when where you're hinting it. But when you're telling them to go about, you're telling them to go back and and plug it back in. You're telling them to fix their mistake. You're not telling them to fix your mistake. You're telling them, put it back the way I left it. Don't touch it. Like, that's your mistake. You have to correct your own mistake. So, but again, but that was when it was hot. There, it's very complicated when it gets to telling non-Jews to do things for us on Shabbat.
Even if they're gonna eat from that pot for themselves?
Okay. If this is if this is part of their lunch, like for example, they normally would sit with you at a table for lunch, which is tricky in itself.
Yes, yes.
Okay. It's on one hand, you obviously don't want to insult them by, like, pushing them away from the family and saying, oh, you're someone else. You're not part of us. You're completely, ostracized. And on the other hand, it's not good to give them food of Shabbat. It's the food of Shabbat is meant more for the Jews. And in fact, on Yom Tov, when we are allowed to cook, there is no way to allow cooking for a non-Jew. Meaning, if you would have to add on a little bit more because you have a non-Jew coming to eat over, or you have a non-Jew coming to sit down at the table, even if it's the hired help or whatever, you would not be allowed to cook that on Yom Tov. Okay, so you're cooking on Yom Tov, and you make sure to add an extra piece of fish so that the hired help would be able to sit down and eat. that's a problem. You would not be allowed to cook that on Yom Tov. So this happens very often when you have elderly people and they have they have people that are there. They have like nurses or whatever it is, people that are there to help them out all the time. So you don't want to insult them by basically, putting them in the kitchen, leaving them to eat their own food, and completely not treating them as, or treating them as like outsiders or whatever it is. And on the other hand, you don't necessarily want them to be eating from the Shabbat food. So it's a delicate balance that you have to play. When it's Yom Tov, if you have such a situation, you would have to make sure to cook everything before Yom Tov. Okay, before Yom Tov, so you don't end up cooking anything for the non-Jew on Yom Tov. But if this is their planned food, meaning this is their lunch, and for them they want their lunch to be hot, you would be allowed. And again, it was plugged in before. Then there's no problem for you to tell them to plug it back in.
It happened to a friend of mine last Shabbat that there was a problem with electricity, and they realized the cholent, the plata, everything was cold, and or the kumkum or something. Like, there's no way to have like the lady plug it back and use it.
So very good. Like I said, in general, we prefer not. We prefer not to have the non-Jew do these things. However, if let's put it this way, the entire Shabbat will be ruined because of it, then you would be allowed to tell it to them in remez. You would be allowed to tell it to them through a hint.
Thank you.
Only if it's a problem. Only if it's a problem of electricity, not because I forgot to put out the plata.
I'll get back to that. I'll get back to that one. That's a little bit more. Again, if you forgot, and technically it would be the same thing. Technically, it would be the same thing. You also have to be very, very careful when it comes to all of these reheating and stuff like that. You have to be very, very careful with the laws of bishul, with the laws of cooking on Shabbat.
But if everything is already cooked, she's allowed to cook it again, no? There's a leniency that...
Again, if there is, it depends if it's Ashkenaz, Sepharad. It depends on if it's Ashkenaz. The Ashkenaz are generally more lenient with what they're allowed to reheat, but they're more strict with the ways they can reheat. Okay, so for example, many Ashkenazim won't use a plata. They would have to use something. They would have to put a rack on top of the plata. They would have to put like some sort of separation. For the Sfaradim, we don't need that separation, but we have more limitations as to what we can reheat on Shabbat. So there's a lot of different halachot when it comes to cooking, and that's why I'm saying that when we're dealing with the goy and reheating or turning on things on Shabbat, we have to be very careful with that as well.
But Rabbi, in the situation of when the electricity put off, my husband told me that because I need the hot water for my baby, so my husband told me that if the housekeeper used this water to make a coffee for her, so then we can use this water for us.
So very good. So when it's in regard to the baby, it's a lot more easier, because when it comes to a baby fits under the category of chole she'en bo sakana, a sick person that's not in danger, right? In general, that's the status of a baby. So when it gets to a chole she'en bo sakana, you are allowed to ask a non-Jew to do things for you. Okay, so in particular for that, it's a lot easier especially if it's for the hot water and the baby's gonna need the water for the bottle and all that. So that's a lot easier, and I wouldn't even need the non-Jew to be able to benefit from that water.
But I can benefit of it if she benefits before, right?
Again, once she's already turning it on for the baby, and she's not adding water, she's not She's not changing what was there, meaning what was there already. So again, if they would now have to fill up water and boil water for the bottle, then you would not be allowed to benefit from what's left over. But over here, it's already, everything is already in. It's just a matter of plugging it in. So then it would be okay to benefit afterwards, especially if the water was boiled technically before Shabbat.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, Simcha. All right. There are a few more things. I think we're going to go till the end on Shabbat today, just because I want to more or less finish off these topics. When it comes to borer with liquids, okay, borer by liquids is a lot easier. What does that mean? There's a rule that says, I'm going to say it in Hebrew and translate it. En borer balach ve'et hatzirah teshalach. So it's a rhyme, basically saying there is no borer when it comes to liquid. Ve'et hatzirah, and the wasp teshalach, you send out. Meaning, very often you can have, especially if you're eating outdoors, you can have insects that fall into the liquid. In that case, you can take out the insect right away and just throw it away. Why? When it comes to liquids and it comes to solid in the liquid, there is a very clear differentiation between the two. Meaning, when it gets to solid and liquid, there's a very clear differentiation between the two. So it's as if at that moment they are already separated, right? When you have a pot and inside the pot you have very clear separation between two different things. So you have or you have even in a pan. You put in a pan, you have one side of the pan is rice, one side of the pan is green beans. It's not mixed. It's each one is separated. So there's no problem of separation there. So the same thing technically applies when you have a solid inside the liquid. Now, something else that comes up is if you want to use a filter for liquid on Shabbat. Now, what we were talking about before was technically solid, which is completely separated. So you would be allowed to take it out because it's separated. How about when you use a filter? When you use a filter, the problem with the filter is that we're using a utensil that is made to separate. Now, we said one of the three conditions is that you're not allowed to use a utensil that is meant for separating. And a filter is meant for separating. So how would we be allowed to use a filter on Shabbat? So the answer that they give is because since the water is drinkable as is, the water is drinkable as is, and when we pass it through the filter, we're just making it better. But technically speaking, you can drink the water as it is. So there's no separating being done. You're not accomplishing anything by separating. This means that if the water was dirty, if the water wasn't fit for drinking, you would not be allowed to filter it on Shabbat, because now you're actually doing something that you're accomplishing something by that filtering. So if you have something that is like water that is dirty, you cannot filter it. A possible way to filter it would be if you would have like the filter directly at the end of the cup, and then you pour from the cup through the filter directly into your mouth. So then the separating process is happening at your mouth, and that would be okay. Okay, it's not happening outside of your mouth. That would be one form. Another case that arises very, very often, not very often, especially not in Miami, but especially amongst Sfaradim, where we like to serve tea at the end of the meal. So you have tea bags. Tea bags aren't so problematic. The only thing that you have to be careful of when you're using tea bags is to squeeze them, that you shouldn't be squeezing them, because then it would be a problem of schita, of squeezing. We're going to get to how to make tea on Shabbat Be'ezrat Hashem when we learn about the Bishul. But let's say you have a tea kettle, okay, and you want to use tea leaves. Now, the way tea kettle generally works, or very often works, is you have a sort of filter before the spout inside the tea kettle. So this way you can put in all the tea leaves, and then when you pour the tea, all the tea leaves stay behind in the kettle, and only water comes through the spout. So this would be allowed on Shabbat. You would be allowed to use a tea kettle on Shabbat, even though you can say that the tea kettle is a utensil that is meant for separating. However, the tea kettle is different, or the tea, you can say, is different. Why? Because, like we said before, even if you were to have those tea leaves, directly in your cup, the tea is still drinkable as it is. Meaning, if you have some tea leaves in your cup, it's not going to stop you from drinking the tea. It's not going to make it that you won't be able to drink the tea. It's going to be slightly more annoying, but it's not impossible to drink the tea. And in fact, many people even drink the tea like that. So when I put it into that tea kettle, when I put it into the small utensil, even though the tea leaves are being separated, but it's very similar to just filtering straight water. So that would be okay. Another form of boil that comes up when we're drinking tea is when you use tea bags. Very often you have sediment, you have small pieces of the tea that come out of the bag, and they stay all the way at the bottom, of the tea. The Shulchan Aruch says that we have to be very careful that when we're drinking, we don't drink to the last drop and leave the tea dirt, let's call it dirt, okay, or the tea sediment, we don't leave it behind. We don't. The same thing would apply technically for a wine bottle, right? So we're pouring the wine, and then there's those little bits of sediment left over. When we pour it, we shouldn't pour it that all the liquid comes out exactly, and then we're left with only the sediment. You have to make sure to leave a little bit. So this is also what we try to do. It's not obligated to do when we take out the fly or whatever, the bug from the cup. We take it with a spoon and we take out a little bit of liquid together with whatever the fly is. But over here, you would have to be careful to not leave only the sediment behind, and then take out all the liquid from the cup afterwards. Another halacha that
I just have a question about the fresh mint.
Yes.
I grew up with the only bag tea, because I learned that we cannot put the fresh herbs in the hot water because it's going to be cooked during Shabbat. But my question is that if it's true, and the second, if I can put my mint in before Shabbat in the hot water, boil a little bit, and then I remove it and I keep for the night for Shabbat, I can use it again.
Very good. So this subject of making tea is a subject that's usually talked about when it comes to cooking. Okay, Be'ezrat Hashem, when we go to Bishur, we're gonna see it a little bit more. We can talk about it right now very briefly, where there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to tea leaves for Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. For Sfaradim, there's no problem to put the tea leaves in a kli sheni. What does a kli sheni mean? I have the hot water urn. This is kli rishon. Rishon in Hebrew is the first, meaning this is the first utensil from the fire. Okay, so that's the boiler, the hot water source. That's kli rishon, and then kli sheni is the second utensil. Once it gets to the second utensil, according to Sfaradim, there is no longer any cooking that can be done. The Ashkenazim, they're stricter, and they say that you should use a kli shlishi, a third utensil. So you pour it from the water boiler, you pour it into a cup. That cup is going to be kli sheni. You pour that cup to a third, or to a second cup, sorry. That's going to be your kli shlishi. And then on top of that, you add the leaves. Now, that's technically because Ashkenazim in general, they don't want to be making tea like that. The way Ashkenazim try to make tea on Shabbat is they do exactly what you were saying before. They prepare a tea concentrate before Shabbat. So it doesn't have to be with tea leaves. It can even be with tea bags, right? They take 4 or 5 tea bags. They put it in they fill up 1 cup or half a cup even of hot water, depending on how concentrated they want to be. And then they let the tea sit there. And then every time they want to make tea, so they take from this tea concentrate, they add it to hot water, and then it's going to give you the tea that they drink. This is for the Ashkenazim, how they do their tea on Shabbat. For Sfaradim, as long as it is in the kli sheni, as long as it's in the second utensil, meaning the first cup that you're putting in, you can add the tea leaves at that point, but you cannot pour from the hot water kettle onto the tea leaves directly.
So I put the hot water from the kumkum to my teapot.
Mm-hmm.
And then I put in the cup, and in the cup I put the leaves.
So you're Ashkenaz or Sepharad?
First Sepharad.
Of course. Baruch Hashem, I know there are both. That's why I have to ask. So for Sepharad, technically, what you can do is you fill up the tea kettle. Okay. After you fill up the tea kettle, you add the tea leaves to the tea kettle. If you want to be a little bit more strict, which obviously is better when it comes to Shabbat, what you do is you fill up a cup of hot water, you pour it into the tea kettle. You fill up another cup of hot water, you pour it into the tea kettle. Or again, depending if you have a big cup and you're able to do it directly, you can do it directly. So you fill up a cup, you pour it into the tea kettle, and then you add the tea leaves to the tea kettle. Okay?
I have a question. How about for the French press, the coffee French press?
What is
Okay. So it's called a bodom, if I'm not mistaken, correct? It's if you were to use it for coffee, it's problematic. Okay. If you were to use it for coffee, it's problematic. For tea, it's less problematic. When I say for coffee, I mean specifically coffee grinds, meaning like thick coffee, right? Like you have those the coffees that are meant to be used in a machine with a filter. That would be problematic to use on Shabbat. Okay, there are some that permit, there are some that don't. It would be better not to get into that problem on Shabbat. And the reason is, once again, because when you have the coffee as it is, right? So we're talking about the grinds. When you pour water on those grinds, or even when you add the grinds to the water, at that point, the coffee is not really drinkable. You can't. The coffee is very tough to drink when it has all of those pieces floating around. When we take instant coffee, the instant coffee right away just melts. It melts, it dissolves, it gets into the water. It's all involved in the water. There's nothing there, and you drink it like you're drinking a tea. right? It just colored and flavored water in a way because it got dissolved into the water. When you're using coffee grinds, there are actual pieces that remain. There are actual things that remain, and as you drink it, or as you're drinking the cup, if you don't let everything settle to the bottom, or in this case, if you're going to use the French press, until you push everything down to the bottom, it's very difficult to drink the coffee like that. There are opinions that allow it. There are opinions that allow the French press, but it should be avoided if possible. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So Be'ezrat Hashem, the last halacha, and this is something that I think was asked before even, was if you would be allowed to make ice on Shabbat, ice or even ice cream. The answer is yes, you can make it. However, that's on condition that it's being used for Shabbat. You would not be allowed to make ice to keep for after Shabbat. So if you used all the ice on Shabbat, and now you just want to prepare ice that there should be ice left over for after Shabbat, you would not be allowed to do so. However, if you finished all your ice on Friday night and you want to make sure that you're going to have ice for Shabbat morning, you would be allowed to freeze it for then. The same thing applies with all those like popsicles, like, you want to make for the kids. You pour grape juice in a cup and you put the stick in you would be allowed to do that on Shabbat as long as it is for Shabbat. This is true for Ashkenazim and even for Sfaradim and even Ashkenazim, but again, on the condition that it's being done for Shabbat. So that applies to ice and that applies to ice cream as well. Okay.
I have a question. If you made, let's say, too much and now you have ice left over.
Okay. If it was something that was, this brings us back to also the same topic of boer. If it was made within reason, meaning you made a reasonable amount that you could have normally finished, and then there happened to have been some left over, we're okay with that. But the problem would be if you decide that you're going to be making more on purpose. You say, okay, I'm already making now, so let me just add on an extra tray, right? You're making one tray, you're going to say, you know what, let me just fill up both of the trays, and that's it. The same thing would apply technically also to taking out ice from the ice maker in the freezer. You would be able to do that even if ice is created afterwards on its own. You obviously have to respect any other isurim that could be accompanied with it. Okay, meaning if there's a light that turns on, if you're if it's gonna work right away, you would be allowed to take out ice from the ice maker on Shabbat, as long as there's no other isurim that are happening as you're doing it.
All right, because we are talking about ice. Can I ask a question? What about if I want to make an iced coffee on Shabbat?
Yeah, so then there's no problem with that. Meaning, again, you would have to be careful with bishul. You would have to be careful.
Can I put the ice on the hot? If I put the ice first and then I put the hot water, it's okay?
So very good. We spoke about that. We spoke about that in one of the previous classes, where we said that generally what we don't want is for you to be putting water, even if it's cold water. We don't want you putting water on top of the ice, any soda or any drink. We don't want you putting the drink on top of the ice. We want you putting the ice into the drink, meaning after you prepare the drink, then you add the ice.
That's what I did this Shabbos, and my husband screamed at me. Say, Melina, you're like, how can you're not allowed even to put it? You're changing the whole, like, because it's hot, the water. And then that's what I did. And then I put the ice.
So very good. So if you were, let's talk about making the iced coffee on Shabbat. The best way to do it is you have the coffee, right? and I'm gonna say just for argument's sake, you're using a klisheni.
Yes.
Okay, so you have the coffee. You can have the coffee in a cup, in a separate cup. You take a different cup. You fill up with the hot water from the boiler, and then you pour from this cup onto the coffee. Okay, I'm just saying that again. You don't necessarily have to do it like that. Bezat Hashem, when we're going to get to Bishul, we're going to talk about it a little bit more. So you pour it like that. You add the milk. Okay, and after you finish adding the milk, then you can put the ice inside.
Okay.
And technically speaking, even if you added the ice into the hot water, that's also okay.
Okay.
Okay. But it's much better than putting the ice first. Now, normally when they make an iced coffee, what they do is they put the ice, they pour the milk, and then they pour the hot water on top.
Exactly.
The hot water with the coffee on top, right? That again, it would be better to do it the opposite way, where you're first making the whole coffee, you're making the iced coffee, everything is ready, and then you add the ice later on, and then you just mix it in, and it's basically gonna be the same thing.
Okay. Okay, no, because I actually saw it melting. I saw the ice melting on the coffee. So I was like,
100%. When you pour cold water on ice, you can try it. You can try it at home in the sink. Put ice in the sink, pour cold water on the ice. You'll see it melting in front of you. You'll see it melting just as fast.
oh yeah, okay.
Maybe a little bit slower, but you'll see it melting also right away. You see it visibly shrinking.
Wow, okay. So I'm relaxed now.
Yeah. So it doesn't really make a difference when you do it like that. But the problem is if you were to be pouring the water, even if it's cold water, on top of the ice.
No. Yes, okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So that's all for today, Bezat Hashem.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Shabbat. Shabbat.
Shabbat shalom.